Hello, everybody. Today we are going to focus on the collapse of the Roman Republic. Now, you'll notice that I said the collapse of the Roman Republic. That is the key word there. We're not talking about the collapse of the Roman Empire and it all falling apart. We're just talking about the Republic falling apart. And so we have to start out with, what does that word republic mean? Well, a republic is a government where there are representatives that serve for the people. In America, we have a democratic republic because we have a republic where we choose representatives for us, right? Okay. And so in Rome, in some ways, had that too. They didn't necessarily have as much of a choice per se in who they were voting for, but they chose representatives who made up the government and made the decisions. And so there's a lot of people in, for example, the Senate or the Assembly, like we talked about the other day in government, that served for the people of Rome. Well, we're going to look at how does that collapse and how does that change from having hundreds of people that are part of really running this government and making decisions to one dictator, one emperor who's making those decisions. So that's what this will focus on today. So 2 questions to consider. Number 1, what would need to happen for a democracy like ours, our government, to be destroyed in America? What would have to happen for us to go from having a democracy with thousands of people that we elect to run our government to it being a dictator? Would it be civil war? Would it be absolute anarchy? What would it be? It wouldn't be good, I can tell you that much. But something would obviously have to happen. And what would it take to go from having a democracy to having a dictatorship? From saying, yeah, we're going to have local, state, and national elections to one dictator makes all our decisions. This is a scary thought. And that's what happened in the Roman Empire. And so it's good to look at the reasons why it collapsed to make sure that those things don't happen here. Because while we have a democracy that works, it's not a guarantee that we'll always have a democracy in America. And we could possibly have a dictator someday. And that is something that we truly do not want. So, Rome, republic to dictator. Here's what we have. Ancient Rome went from having a republic with leaders chosen by the people to having a dictatorship with one man in control. So our central question when we analyze this period is how? How did that happen? Well, it starts with a war, and it gets worse from there. A series of wars, actually, 3 wars, called the Punic Wars. They were fought between 264 and 146 BC. Now, the Rome here in Italy fought against Carthage, which is in North Africa. Both were kingdoms on the rise, you could say. They're trying to expand, they're trying to create empires, and because they were so close together, they were fighting over territory in the Mediterranean, and they both wanted more power. And so even though Rome is victorious after 3 wars, it causes a lot of devastation to Rome and a lot of conflicts between the upper class, the ruling class, and the lower class, especially farmers who have to fight as soldiers during the war for Rome. So we'll talk some more about that later. To get a better background on it, you can click here for a video on YouTube. I think it's about 11 minutes. It should look like this for you. The Punic War, Causes, Summary, and Hannibal. And this is from Jackie McBroom. But just a great overview of this. You can find that on Google Classroom. I have it listed there. Otherwise, you can always go to the link in the PowerPoint, as I am in the PowerPoint right here. So let's get back to our slide. And here we go. Results of the Punic War. There's a few different things. Number 1, Rome expands. It gains new territory and strength. And so when it takes over this new territory, it's kind of like we talked about with the Greeks. When they win wars, they take slaves and they take people and make them slaves. And so there's new territory, new strength. Slaves are going to come in. There's going to be some problems with that too. Second, many Roman farmers left their farms to fight in the army. And so the question is, what are they going to come back home to? Is their farm going to be there? Has somebody taken it? Has it been destroyed by the enemy? What are you going to see? Well, here's our answer to part of that question. The Roman countryside, including many of the farms that the soldiers who were farmers left, was destroyed by Hannibal and the Carthaginian army when they went through Rome. The Romans mainly protected the large cities, but they kind of left the farmland open and vulnerable. And so a lot of it was destroyed. And so many soldiers come home and their farmland's destroyed. And many slaves are taken from conquered territories. And this is going to become a major problem because of the way they're used. It's going to cause some issues for those farmers that were soldiers. So we're going to do a reading in a second here. This is the reading. And as we read through this, I want you to think about, how are those farmers affected? So here we go. I'll read the whole thing. And then if you look at your notes, we're going to break it into sections and you're going to try to answer some cause and effect questions. Expansion creates problems in the Roman Republic. The Punic Wars and Rome's increasing wealth and expanding empire brought many problems. The most serious was the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Rich landowners lived on huge estates called latifundia. Many of these estates had been created by occupying conquered lands and by taking farms left unattended by soldiers serving in the army. Romans had made slaves of thousands of captured people during the wars. These slaves were made to work on the latifundia. By 100 BC, slaves formed perhaps 1/3 of Rome's population. Small farmers found it difficult to compete with the large estates run by the slave labor. Some could not afford to repair the damage caused by Hannibal's invasion. They sold their land to wealthy landowners. Many of these farmers, a large number of whom were returning soldiers, became homeless and jobless. Many stayed in the countryside and worked as seasonal migrant laborers. Some headed to Rome and other cities to looking for work. The landless and unskilled in the cities found few jobs. They joined the ranks of the urban poor, a group that totaled about 1/4 of Roman society. While wealthy Romans became corrupted by money and luxury, discontent arose among the slaves. Resentment also grew among the poor. Class tension planted the seeds of the Republic's collapse. So things aren't going very well because of this war and the results from the war. And a lot of the lower class citizens feel like their government is not protecting them. And democracy, a republic, will not work if it is not protecting the people. We've seen that continuously throughout history. So let's break this down and look at different sections in order to answer the questions that you have. So the two causes here that you have in your chart, we're going to have to fill in the effects for. The first one is wealthy become wealthier due to the Punic Wars. What is the effect? And second, the Romans take over land and farms in conquered territories. What is the effect there? So let's look at this first sentence, two sentences here for that first question. The Punic Wars and Rome's increasing wealth and expanding empire brought many problems. The most serious was the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And so when you look at the cause, the wealthy become wealthier. What effect does that have for the poor? And what does it do with the gap you see between the rich and the poor? Is that gap getting closer so that the rich and the poor have more equal money, or is it getting further apart? So the rich are really wealthy and the poor are really poor. What do you see happening? You can put that for your effect right here. Pause if you need to while you write that in. And I'll go on to the next question. Romans take over land and farms and conquer territories. What's the effect? There's going to be two things we need to talk about here. Rich landowners lived on huge estates called latifundia. Many of these estates had been created by occupying conquered lands and by taking farms left unattended by soldiers serving in the army. So how do they get these massive farms? Well, two things are happening here. Number one, when it says these latifundia, these big farms, have been created by occupying conquered lands. So they take over new land, and then rich people buy that land from the government. And so now you have these big farms that didn't exist before. But this second part, well, I tell you what, as a farmer's son, this one really gets me. All right. So let's take a look at this right here. By taking farms left unattended by soldiers serving in the army. Sorry about my penmanship, but think about that. You go to serve in the army, you're away fighting, and you come back, and some wealthy man has taken over your farm. and it's no longer yours. And you can't do anything about it because the law is going to favor that wealthy man. So he's not fighting the war. You are, and you come home and your land is gone. Whew, yikes. So when we look at the effect, what do we see happening with farms? Who's gaining more land? Who's losing the land? You can write about a few of those things. And pause if you need to do that. And then let's look at this last part here. Okay. Romans had made slaves of thousands of captured people during the wars. These slaves were made to work on the latifundia. Okay, so you lose your land. It's taken over by the wealthy. And now the wealthy go out, and some of the conquered people they buy as slaves. And those slaves now work on the big farms, land that used to be yours. So you're a farmer who has no land, and the land that used to be yours, do they need you to farm on it? No, you're not needed because the slaves are doing the work now. So what does that mean for you? You're out of a job. Okay? So there's a lot of things that we can talk about there in terms of the effect. I would say talk about what happens to people who become slaves, where they put, what kind of jobs do they have. That would be the biggest one to add right there. And we'll talk about the farmers on the next slide. So, okay, here we go. Let me get rid of this so I can see my reading. Okay. Sorry, let me just pause this for a second. Okay, we're going to look at 3 questions, causes here, and the effects of them. The first one, farmers could not compete with new, larger farms, or their farms were too damaged by Hannibal's raids. What happens because of that? What happens for farmers that stay in the countryside? And what happens for the landless and unskilled workers who could not find jobs in the cities? So we're going to try to figure out as we read what are the effects for those. So I'll read this here, and then I'll go from there. By 100 BC, slaves formed perhaps 1/3 of Rome's population. Small farmers found it difficult to compete with the large estates run by slave labor. Some could not afford to repair the damage caused by Hannibal's invasions. And so that's what I talked about right here, right? They couldn't compete, or they were too damaged. So let's see what the effect is. They sold their lands to wealthy landowners. Many of these farmers, a large number of whom were returning soldiers, became homeless and jobless. All right, so you can't compete. The big guy with the slaves can produce things for less money, and therefore you can't sell your goods and make a profit. So what do? The effect here, well, you sell the farm, right? Now, selling the farm has some major consequences. And the first one is you no longer have a home because you sold it. So you have to leave. So you're homeless. You have nowhere to go, possibly. The second one is while you get money for selling your farm, money runs out and you don't have a job. And so while you have a little bit of money at first, maybe for a place to stay or for food to eat, in time you're going to be out. And now the slaves are doing the farm work. So, you know, the only skills you have farming outside of being a soldier are gone. And how do you deal with that? So let's see what it says continuing on. So talk about the effect for farmers. What do they choose to do because their farms are damaged or they can't compete? What do they do with their farms? So you can put that in, pause if you need to. The second one, let's look at what happens to farmers that live in the countryside and those that move to the city. So I'll start right here. Many of these farmers, a large number of whom were returning soldiers, became homeless and jobless. Many stayed in the countryside and worked as seasonal migrant laborers. So that fits for our effect right here. So what does it mean to be a seasonal migrant laborer? Well, seasonal means you work during certain periods of the year. For farming, that would be maybe during planting season, but definitely during harvest season. We have a lot of seasonal workers that come into the United States during harvest season. And you're a migrant laborer, so you're traveling around. So you go from living on your own farm, producing crops, making a living, to traveling from place to place, getting jobs whenever you can. it's not a great existence. It doesn't make a lot of money, and it probably doesn't provide enough for what you need all the time. So you can talk about what effect does it have? What jobs do we see for farmers that stay in the countryside there? And then lastly, some headed to Rome and other cities looking for work. The landless and unskilled in the cities found few jobs. They joined the ranks of the urban poor, a group that totaled about 1/4 of Roman society. So in reality, farmers that go to the cities, what is the effect? Do they find jobs? Do they find work? Do they have money? The answer to that question is not very good. So finish filling in your chart. Do you want to share it with Mr. Foley so he can see it and look it over? I certainly will, or Mr. Elling, whoever's teaching your class. So things are not looking good. Farmers are mad, really mad, because they don't have their farms anymore. They don't have a good way to make money. And all this happens because they win a war. Imagine it, you leave your farm to fight, you win the war, and in the end you lose your farm and you don't have any money left. Well, thanks a lot, government. Look at what you did to us, right? So they're really upset with all of this. So the last part of that reading says, while wealthy Romans became corrupted by money and luxury, discontent arose among the slaves. Resentment also grew among the poor. Class tensions planted the seeds of the republic's collapse. And if we go back, it said that slaves, let's see here, where were they? Slaves made up 1/3 of Rome's population. The urban poor made up 1/4 of Rome's population. So over half of the population is either poor or slaves in the Roman Republic. What does that mean for this government, for this republic? How do you feel about your government if half of you are slaves or you're absolutely poor? Obviously, you're not feeling very good, and you're not feeling like the government took care of you. So class tensions rise. The poor look at the rich and say, you're the reason that my life is so horrible. And they're right, they are. The majority of the population has little money or work. It's a very bad situation. So think about this, and you have fill-in notes and there's boxes to fill in, and this is one of the questions on there. How would people feel in a democracy if the rich are getting richer and the majority of the population is very poor and cannot find work? How would you feel if you're an American and you see the rich getting wealthy, but you lose your home, you lose your job, and you don't have much to live off of, and you're looking around and a lot of people are like you? So take a second and write in your thoughts there. How does it make you feel about your government? All right, moving forward. Civil war breaks out in Rome. As we know, civil war is a war where part of a country is fighting against another part. Sometimes it's wealthy versus poor. Sometimes it's one political group against another. Sometimes it's North versus South, like in the American Civil War. We're going to look at 4 different causes that Rome went into a civil war. And for each of these, think about why would this cause a civil war. So here we go. Number 1, leaders fight for power. You start to see that some Romans, they view this as an opportunity. They realize that, hey, this republic is collapsing, and maybe I can become strong now and I can take over. So talk about how does that lead to a civil war if your leadership is fighting each other for power instead of working together to find solutions? That's your first one. Take a second to do that. Pause if you need to. Reason number 2. 1/4 of Romans were poor and jobless. Imagine if 25% of Americans could not find a job. And we're not talking about because of the coronavirus. I think right now we're at around 10, 11% as I record this in August of 2020 without work. But that's because of this, all of a sudden, this shift, right? Imagine that if for years you can't find a job, 1/4 of all people. How could that lead to a civil war? It certainly could. But why might having people be poor lead to fighting? Number 3, Fighting between social classes. Why could you have a civil war if there's more and more fighting between the rich and the poor? How does that cause bigger tensions? And the fourth one, powerful military leaders. If military leaders are very powerful and they see that the government's collapsing, what could they do? And how would that lead to civil war? This is going to be a really big one that we talk about a little bit more here going forward. So the military change. The military generals begin to gain political power. And a lot of time military generals try to stay out of politics. They try to stay out of government when they're leading. But what's happening here is the military generals see that the Senate is not working. The assemblies are not working for Rome. And there's this vacuum of power where they could potentially take over. And what's interesting is they have a very distinct advantage. Remember those farmers that were soldiers? What happened to them? They lost their farms, they lost their jobs, they're broke, they're homeless, they're bitter. When they were in the army, they followed the generals. And guess what happened? When they would take over a city, they were allowed to plunder. They were allowed to take goods, to take money, to take maybe gold, whatever it was. And so when they were under the leadership of the military generals, they were doing okay. They always had food. They always had shelter and things like that. And so what these military generals do is they come back to these homeless farmers that used to be soldiers and they say, hey, look, if you fight for me in my private army, I'll give you land. You'll have a home again. And all of a sudden you have all these former farmers who are now poor that are swearing allegiance to their general. And so you may have this general gets all these former farmers and soldiers, and this general gets all these former farmers or soldiers, and they clash against each other. And the Roman general that had the largest army could now possibly take power. And so instead of the military generals serving the government, the military generals are serving to become the government, to become a dictatorship. That becomes their goal. So take a second and think about, based on what we've talked about, if you're a former soldier, why would you be willing to follow a military leader? And remember to keep looking at your notes, as some of these are boxes you need to fill in. And a second question, why would you choose to fight for a general and not the government of your nation? Remember, we're in Rome. Think about your stance as a farmer and as a former soldier. How do you feel about the Roman Republic? You know, what happened when you came back from war? Did the Roman Republic make sure you were taken care of? And why might you side with a general instead of fighting for this republic and this nation? So take a second to write about that. Okay, before we get into what's called the first triumvirate, it's a good time to talk about an assignment you have coming up. One of the assignments you're going to work on is called the Angry Farmer Interview. I love this assignment. And you're one of these angry farmers that turned soldier. And you have to talk about, you know, why are you upset? What has happened to you? And what have you decided to do to make money, to make a living? And so all the information that you've seen so far fits really well with that assignment and can give you a good idea of what to do with that. Okay, I digress. Moving forward. For a long period of time, military dictators take over in Rome, and one person's the leader, and then it might be somebody else. And it's not until we have the first triumvirate that we really have a strong government that lasts in Rome. The first triumvirate was 3 rulers, Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Pompey. And they rule from 60 to 50 BC. So for 10 years, they're in charge, which was a long time because the Civil War was ongoing. All 3 were generals. All 3 brought different things to the table. Crassus was very wealthy, and that wealth obviously served well in gaining more soldiers. Julius Caesar was a general who was very loved by his soldiers and was victorious very often. And Pompey was a very popular general in Rome. And so he had his army in Rome. And so these three generals come together and they create their own government. They're able to defeat their enemies and create their own government. However, it doesn't last. And it doesn't last for a variety of reasons. We'll get to that in a second. So, why do you think having this group of three leaders, why may they have more success at forming a military government than dictators did? So why having three, would they be more successful than in the past just one military leader becoming a dictator? Talk that over. Think it through. Whenever I talk about this, I think about being in college and basketball, the NBA. And in the NBA, when I was in college, you saw the Miami Heat. And they brought together three people. You had Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh. And each of these people were the superstar on the team that they were a part of. But then they all three joined together on the same team. And all of a sudden you had this massive force, these three superstars with other players around them. And the Heat were good. And they won the NBA Finals. I don't know how many times, but they were winning games like crazy. And so I kind of equate this to the same thing we see when we look at Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Pompey. Each of them individually was very powerful, but putting them all together gives you a chance to do something that other people couldn't do. And that's exactly it. However, it didn't last because there was some fear about Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was a powerful leader, and he was a genius at warfare. The man won. The places he went to fight, he won in. He served for 1 year as a consul. Remember, that was kind of the highest position you could have, except for being a dictator. And he became the governor of Gaul, which was France. And he conquered this territory, this basically France. And his soldiers really, they were very loyal to him. They loved him. And part of that was because they won battles. He seemed to have respect for his soldiers, all those different kinds of things. Well, all of this victory creates some fear of Caesar. Crassus and Pompey, they're worried that he might try to take over and become leader on his own. And so they come up with some plans. And Pompey, along with the Senate, there's still a Senate when these three are in charge. It really doesn't have a ton of power per se, but the Senate and Pompey demand that Caesar releases his army, sends him home, and that he returns to Rome by himself. Now think about this if you're Caesar. You're being told to leave your army behind, and you're going to go into Rome where, Pompey is kind of possibly jealous. He's concerned about you. And you're supposed to go into Rome by yourself while Pompey has an army there. Yikes. So what do you think? Write it down. What do you think Caesar's going to do? Is he going to leave his army behind and go to Rome as he's commanded to by the government, the Senate? Or is he going to cross into Rome with his army and try to take over? Which one do you think he'll do? Well, here's what he does. He crosses the Rubicon River and he rides into Rome. And Pompey and his army, they flee. They are later defeated. Crassus is out of the picture by this point. And what we see is that Julius Caesar becomes the leader of Rome. And you saw that this happened 49 BC, 46 BC, so this is 3 years later. The Senate declares Julius Caesar the dictator. Now, a dictator is supposed to serve for only 6 months, but when you take over Rome as he did, the Senate kind of does what you want. And in 44 BC, Caesar is named dictator for life. He is now, in effect, the one leader in Rome. And so this is where we really see that the Republic, this government in Rome that's supposed to be, representatives serving the people, it's gone. The rise of Julius Caesar as dictator for life really marks the end of the Republic and a beginning of a new era. He fills the Senate with his friends and supporters. And so even though you have a Senate there, it's basically all his buddies that are added in so that they'll vote however he wants them to. And he becomes an absolute ruler, a person that has complete power. And while he does a lot of things as dictator that serve the people well, and he takes care of some people. Others obviously are upset that the Senate lost their power. They don't like that he's dictator. And so he's stabbed to death. He's killed. And with his death, we have a new civil war. Who is going to be the next leader? And the big change we see here is the new leader is not going to be chosen by democracy. This person's not going to be chosen by voting. It's going to be chosen by power and force. And that's a scary thing. We're coming up on an election, and it looks like it'll be President Donald Trump versus former Vice President Joe Biden. And that'll be decided by voting. It's very scary to think about if that was decided by force, you know, it was a bigger army and what that would mean for our country. But that's what it became for Rome. And so what happens is you have this Roman Empire is beginning to be built, and these emperors are going to come forward, and one may rule for a few years, but then he's taken out by another person and they become the ruler, or maybe 20 years or whatever it might be. But stability kind of goes out the window to a large degree. Augustus, the next person who will be in charge, he rules for a while, and that's okay. But after that, you see some rulers don't last very long and stability is lost. So concluding questions, I have 2 of them for you to think about, and you can answer on your notes form. Number 1, what is the difference between a republic and an empire that has a dictator? So hopefully you figured this out as we talked. What is the difference between a republic, like we have in the United States, and a dictatorship? And the big question that I want you to be able to answer, that will be a test question most likely, is why did the Roman Republic collapse? What are the reasons we see that we have this republic and somewhat a form of democracy shift to a dictatorship? So if you have any questions as you looked at this, feel free to contact your teacher. We are here to help however possible, and we will go from there. Take care.